The galaxy trembled as the Kralzer Dominion made their move. General Vrothak stood at the helm of his flagship, his imposing figure encased in the shimmering alloys of Kralzerian armor. His voice boomed across the command chamber, a deep, guttural rumble amplified by the cybernetic enhancements that linked him to his fleet. Earth's defiance is an insult to the Dominion. We will reduce their pitiful planet to ashes and carve our names into the annals of conquest. The alien fleet loomed in the void, a sprawling armada of warships bristling with advanced weaponry. Thousands of soldiers, bred for battle and fused with technology, prepared for an invasion they considered inevitable. To the Kralzer, Earth was no more than a backwater world, a final conquest before solidifying their dominion over the galaxy. There was no expectation of resistance, only a choreographed spectacle of annihilation. Simulations ran seamlessly, showing Earth's fragile defenses crumbling under their firepower. Their confidence was absolute. Vrothak's officers, precise and mechanical in their movements, monitored the status of the fleet. A cold efficiency defined their every action, each alien's mind tethered to the hive network that granted them flawless coordination. Their strategy had been refined over centuries of galactic domination: overwhelm, destroy, subjugate. Yet, there was an air of theatricality in this assault. Earth's continued existence was an insult, and the destruction would be made exemplary. The general's gaze fell on a massive holographic projection of Earth, a rotating sphere of blues and greens. He felt no pity for the humans below. Primitive, chaotic, fragile, their species was an aberration in the galaxy's grand order. "Dispatch the scouts," he commanded. "Let us take measure of their defenses." The smaller ships surged forward, sleek and menacing as they pierced Earth's atmosphere. On board, Kralzerian warriors readied themselves, their minds racing with contempt for the creatures they were about to obliterate. Reports of resistance flickered in. The humans were indeed fighting back, though the Kralzer dismissed it as a futile gesture. Missiles and aircraft engaged the alien scouts, but were swiftly neutralized by energy shields and countermeasures. Earth's military, outgunned and overwhelmed, scrambled for a strategy, desperate to buy time against an enemy they could barely comprehend. On the surface, chaos erupted. Cities buzzed with panicked broadcasts, civilians packed into shelters, and governments held emergency councils. Earth's leaders knew their forces were insufficient. The enemy's weapons could vaporize entire cities with precision strikes, and their hive-mind coordination rendered traditional tactics obsolete. Surrender seemed inevitable, the only path to survival. Yet, despite the despair, there remained a flicker of defiance, a hope born of humanity's history of resilience. Far from the chaos of command centers and military installations, a quiet town basked in ignorance of the unfolding apocalypse. There, in a modest home lined with flower boxes and wind chimes, Grandma Mildred hummed to herself. The smell of freshly baked cookies filled her kitchen as she arranged them neatly on a cooling rack. A nearby radio murmured news of the alien invasion, but Mildred paid it no mind. "Another war, another fuss," she muttered, brushing flour from her apron. She shuffled to her living room, her steps light yet deliberate. A newspaper sat crumpled on the coffee table, the headline bold, "Alien Fleet Spotted in Orbit." Mr. Whiskers, her chubby tabby cat, leaped onto her lap, purring contentedly. "Well, at least you're not worried," she said, scratching behind his ears. Mildred's demeanor radiated calm, a stark contrast to the mounting hysteria gripping the planet. Outside, her neighbor Doris waved frantically from across the street. "Mildred! Did you hear? They're saying the end is near. Aliens. Big ships. Are you evacuating?" Mildred waved back with a warm smile, her voice steady. "Don't you fret, Doris. Everything will work out." She turned back inside, muttering under her breath, "It always does." She returned to her kitchen and picked up her rolling pin, smoothing out dough with methodical precision. Each movement was deliberate, her hands steady. Yet, beneath the domestic routine lay a discipline honed over decades. Her calm belied a sharpness, a readiness that had not dulled with time. To any observer, she was an unassuming grandmother. But to those who knew her history, though few remained alive to remember, she was something else entirely. As the alien scouts continued their probes, Vrothak reviewed their findings with a sneer. They scatter like insects. No coordination. No strategy. Pathetic. His officers nodded in agreement, their hive-mind unity reinforcing his disdain. The planet's resistance was less than trivial. He began drafting the final stage of their assault, envisioning the moment Earth cities would fall beneath the Dominion's might. But even as he planned, something nagged at him, a faint anomaly in the reports. One scout ship had failed to return, its signal cutting out unexpectedly. It was a minor detail, unworthy of his attention, yet it persisted. "Send a recovery team," he growled, dismissing the thought. Earth posed no threat. Back in her home, Grandma Mildred glanced at an old, dusty communicator hidden at the back of her pantry. A faint red light blinked on its surface, accompanied by a soft, insistent hum. She sighed, brushing her hands on her apron before picking it up. "This better be important," she said, her tone sharper than her earlier pleasantries. A voice crackled through the device, urgent and familiar. "Mildred, it's happening. We need you." She closed her eyes for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I thought I was done with this nonsense," she murmured. Setting the communicator down, she returned to her cookies, her rolling pin steady in her hands. But for the first time that day, her mind wandered, not to baking, but to memories she had long buried. Mildred leaned against the counter, her rolling pin set down carefully beside her cooling cookies. The blinking light on the communicator didn't stop, its persistent hum a reminder of a past she had tried to leave behind. She knew better than to ignore it. Picking it up, she adjusted the dials with practiced precision, and a familiar voice came through. "Mildred, it's urgent. The Krauser are here. We're out of options." Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I told you before, I'm retired. Let the younger ones handle it." "We don't have younger ones," the voice replied sharply. "There's no one else who can do what you do. They've taken out most of our defenses already. If you don't step in, Earth is finished." For a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes wandered to the windowsill, where the sun cast a golden glow on her potted plants. She had built this life for herself after years of fighting. A quiet life. A simple one. But the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. She knew that call would come someday, and she had always dreaded the moment. With a sigh, she turned back to the communicator. "Fine. But I'm not promising anything." She pressed a button under her kitchen counter, and the sound of shifting mechanisms filled the room. A section of the floor slid aside, revealing a staircase leading into the depths below. As she descended, the walls changed from the cozy warmth of her home to cold steel. She entered a room filled with artifacts of her past life, carefully preserved weapons, armor, and tools, each with its own story of survival and victory. Her fingers brushed over the rolling pin on a workbench. Unlike the one she used for baking, this one gleamed with a metallic sheen, engraved with intricate patterns that concealed its true nature. A weapon disguised as a humble kitchen tool, it had been her constant companion in countless battles. Next to it sat knitting needles that doubled as throwing weapons, a teapot capable of generating electromagnetic pulses, and a toolkit that held devices even she hadn't fully mastered. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved a small notebook, flipping through its pages. Each one held coded notes and diagrams from her time in the Earth Defense Corps, strategies for dismantling advanced alien tech. The Krauser's hive mind was something she had studied extensively. It was their greatest strength, and she knew it could also be their greatest weakness. Back upstairs, the communicator buzzed again. "Mildred, we've detected movement. They're sending scout teams to your location. You need to move now." "I'm aware," she replied curtly, strapping the rolling pin to her side and tucking the notebook into her apron pocket. Before heading out, she paused by the cookie tray, wrapping a few in foil. No sense facing aliens on an empty stomach, she muttered. Outside, the quiet street seemed untouched by the chaos that loomed overhead. Yet, the faint hum of approaching ships grew louder. Mildred's sharp eyes scanned the sky as she adjusted her grip on the rolling pin. The scout team would arrive soon, and she had no intention of letting them disrupt her neighborhood. She moved with deliberate purpose, every step calculated, her unassuming demeanor belying the readiness of a seasoned warrior. The first ship descended, sleek and ominous, its metallic surface glinting in the sunlight. Mildred stood her ground, calm and unmoving, as it hovered above her driveway. The hatch opened, and Kralzarian soldiers emerged, their cybernetic enhancements humming with energy. They paused, clearly confused by the sight of an elderly woman standing alone before them. One of them stepped forward, his voice distorted through his translator. "Human, you are ordered to surrender. Resistance is futile." Mildred tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Well, that's rude," she said. "Didn't your mother teach you to say please?" The soldier raised his weapon, but before he could fire, she moved. The rolling pin in her hand glowed faintly, emitting a pulse that disrupted the soldier's cybernetics. They froze, their movements jerky and erratic, as she advanced. With precision honed by years of training, she disarmed them one by one, her rolling pin striking with surprising force. The leader of the group struggled to regain control, his cybernetics sparking as he raised his voice. "How? How is this possible? You're just a..." "Grandma," she finished for him, smirking. "Sweetheart, I'm much more than that." With the scouts incapacitated, Mildred retrieved a device from her apron and placed it on the ship's console. It emitted a signal that scrambled the ship's systems, ensuring it wouldn't be able to report back to the fleet. She stepped back, watching as the once imposing vessel sputtered and powered down. As she returned to her house, she noticed her neighbor Doris peeking through the curtains, her face pale with shock. Mildred waved cheerfully. "Nothing to worry about, dear. Just some rowdy visitors." Inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, her expression momentarily serious. The Kralzer wouldn't stop with scouts. They'd send reinforcements, bigger and deadlier. She had bought Earth a little time, but not much. Her mind raced with plans, her years of experience taking over. The hive mind was the key. If she could disrupt it on a larger scale, the fleet would collapse into disarray. Mildred sat at her kitchen table, unwrapping one of her cookies and taking a bite as she scribbled notes in her old notebook. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a reminder of how little time she had. The Kralzer thought they were invincible, but they hadn't accounted for her. And they certainly hadn't accounted for the human spirit, stubborn, resourceful, and far more dangerous than they could imagine. She glanced at Mr. Whiskers, who had curled up on the counter. "Looks like we've got work to do, buddy," she said. The cat yawned, unimpressed, but Mildred's resolve was unshakable. The Kralzer fleet hovered ominously above Earth, their sleek, black ships blotting out the sun in some regions. On board the command ship, General Vrothak reviewed the reports of the failed scout mission. His sharp, angular features twisted in confusion and irritation. The footage from the scout ship was brief but baffling, a lone human, an elderly female, standing in the middle of a quiet street. She had disabled his soldiers with primitive, unpredictable tactics and rendered an advanced ship useless. "This must be a glitch," he growled, slamming a clawed hand on the console. No human could single-handedly disable a scout team. Dispatch a strike force. I want this anomaly erased. As reinforcements descended, Mildred was already preparing for them. In her basement, she gathered supplies, some carefully preserved tools of her trade, others cobbled together from household items. The knitting needles she sharpened and waited for precise throws. The teapot received a final adjustment, its EMP charge calibrated to maximum disruption. Even her rolling pin was upgraded, its hidden circuits glowing faintly as it hummed to life. Above her house, the alien ships hovered menacingly, their soldiers deploying in a precise formation. They advanced down her street, their movements methodical and synchronized, weapons drawn. The lead soldier signaled the others to fan out, scanning for threats. Mildred waited, watching from behind her curtains, her eyes narrowing. The first alien to approach her porch barely had time to register her presence before she stepped out with an air of calm authority. "Back again, are we?" she said, hands resting on her hips. The soldiers raised their weapons, but before they could fire, she tossed a small object, a tea bag that exploded on impact, releasing a cloud of shimmering particles. The Krauser soldiers froze, their systems overwhelmed by the interference. With a speed that belied her age, Mildred followed up, striking the disoriented soldiers with her rolling pin. Each hit was precise, targeting critical points in their armor and disabling their cybernetic enhancements. The lead soldier managed to regain some control, lunging toward her with a blade, but she sidestepped effortlessly, deflecting the attack with a flick of her wrist. The blade shattered against the rolling pin. The soldiers regrouped, retreating momentarily to recalibrate their systems. Mildred used the brief lull to activate her teapot. With a soft whistle, it released a wave of electromagnetic energy that rippled through the street. The alien soldiers stumbled, their communications severed, their hive mind fractured. They were no longer a seamless unit but a disoriented, vulnerable group. Mildred didn't stop. She moved with purpose, her movements a blend of efficiency and ingenuity. She used the environment to her advantage, leading the aliens into carefully laid traps, tripwires disguised as garden hoses, pressure-activated devices hidden in flower pots. Each step they took brought more confusion, more failure. In the chaos, one soldier managed to signal the mothership, transmitting a fragmented message about the anomaly they were facing. General Vrothak watched the feed, his rage growing. The humans were supposed to be an inferior species, incapable of such resistance. Yet here was one woman, a single human, dismantling his forces with tools that looked like household objects. "She's toying with us," he snarled. "Increase the deployment. Send the assault droids. No more games." The next wave descended, this time accompanied by towering droids armed with heavy plasma cannons. Mildred saw them coming and adjusted her strategy. She lured the droids into an alley where their size worked against them. With a swift move, she threw a modified knitting needle at the nearest droid. The needle embedded itself in its chest, releasing a charge that fried its circuits. The droid collapsed in a heap of sparking metal. The other droids hesitated, their programming struggling to adapt to such unorthodox tactics. Mildred seized the opportunity, using her rolling pin to deflect plasma shots and her EMP teapot to disable their targeting systems. One droid managed to fire a shot that grazed her shoulder, burning through her sleeve. She winced, but remained undeterred. "You'll pay for that one," she muttered, her voice low and determined. From a nearby rooftop, she spotted the remaining soldiers regrouping with the droids, forming a defensive perimeter. Mildred reached into her apron and pulled out a small, unassuming device. She pressed a button, and the streetlights flickered before going out entirely. In the darkness, she moved silently, her presence felt only in the occasional flash of light or the sound of a rolling pin striking metal. When the lights came back on, the battlefield was a mess of disabled soldiers and dismantled droids. Mildred stood in the center, her rolling pin resting on her shoulder, her apron smudged but intact. She looked up at the sky, where the mothership loomed larger than ever. She knew this was far from over. The Krauser wouldn't stop until she took the fight directly to them. General Vrothak, now visibly enraged, slammed his fists on the console. "This ends now," he barked. "Prepare the main weapon. We'll obliterate her entire location." As the mothership charged its weapon, Mildred returned to her kitchen, taking a moment to catch her breath. She glanced at the communicator on her counter, now buzzing with frantic messages from Earth's leaders. They begged her to hold the line, to buy them more time. She ignored the noise, instead reaching for a jar of cookies. Taking a bite, she allowed herself a small smile. The Krauser thought they had her cornered. They didn't realize she was just getting started. With one hand, she adjusted the strap of her rolling pin. With the other, she activated a hidden switch beneath her table, revealing a holographic map of the alien fleet. "Time to take the fight to them," she said to herself, her voice steady and calm. The rolling pin hummed faintly in her hand, ready for whatever came next. The Krauser mothership hovered like a harbinger of doom, its colossal shadow stretching across the sky. General Vrothak stood in the center of the command deck, his rage boiling over. Reports from the ground had become increasingly absurd, describing a single human dismantling their forces with incomprehensible tactics. He refused to accept it. "Target her location," he commanded coldly. "Fire at full power. Reduce everything to ash." The massive weapon systems of the mothership charged, glowing with an ominous crimson hue. From Earth, the sky seemed to ignite, casting a foreboding glow over the landscape. But Mildred was already moving. She had studied the Krauser's strategies for years, and she knew the limitations of their technology. They relied too heavily on their hive mind, their rigid precision incapable of adapting to true chaos. Inside her modest home, she activated her final contingency plan. A small, unassuming device sat on her kitchen table, wires snaking out like veins. With a flick of a switch, it emitted a pulse that disrupted the mothership's targeting systems, causing their weapon to misfire. The beam veered off course, obliterating an uninhabited mountainside instead. Vrothak slammed his fists onto the console, his voice a feral roar. "What is this? How is she?" He stopped himself, taking a deep breath to regain composure. "Prepare my transport. I will deal with this anomaly personally." Mildred watched as a smaller ship detached from the mothership, descending rapidly toward her location. She had expected this. The Krauser's arrogance would demand that their leader confront her directly, and she was ready. Her rolling pin rested in her hand, its weight familiar and comforting. The ship landed with a thunderous crash, and the ground shook as Vrothak emerged, towering and imposing. His armor gleamed, his cybernetic enhancements pulsing with energy. He radiated power and malice, a living embodiment of the Krauser's might. Behind him, an elite squad of soldiers fanned out, forming a protective perimeter. "You," he snarled, pointing a clawed finger at her. "You are the cause of this humiliation. A feeble, insignificant human. Do you truly believe you can stand against the might of the Dominion?" Mildred tilted her head, her expression serene. "You talk too much, dear. Why don't you come over here and find out?" Vrothak lunged, his movements swift and lethal, but Mildred was faster. She sidestepped his attack with a grace that belied her years, bringing her rolling pin down on his arm with a resounding crack. Sparks flew as his armor buckled under the impact. He snarled in pain and surprise, his confidence shaken. His soldiers moved to intervene, but Mildred anticipated them. With a flick of her wrist, she hurled one of her knitting needles, its sharp tip embedding itself in the ground at their feet. It emitted a high-pitched whine before releasing a shockwave that sent them sprawling. "Stay out of this," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving Vrothak. He charged again, his cybernetic enhancements giving him inhuman speed and strength. But his attacks were wild, driven by rage, while Mildred remained composed. She used his size against him, weaving around his strikes and exploiting the gaps in his armor. Her rolling pin struck again and again, each blow precise and devastating. "You're not used to losing, are you?" she said, her tone almost teasing. "That's the problem with bullies. They crumble when someone stands up to them." Vrothak roared, his cybernetics overloading as he unleashed a desperate attack. Energy crackled around him, and the ground split beneath his feet. Mildred remained unfazed. She reached into her apron and pulled out a small jar of what looked like sugar. As Vrothak charged, she threw it at him. The powder coated his armor, and within seconds, it began to corrode, eating away at the metal and exposing the vulnerable flesh beneath. He stumbled, his movements sluggish as the hive mind struggled to compensate for the damage. Mildred saw her opening. She stepped forward, her rolling pin glowing with a soft blue light. With one final swing, she struck him square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Vrothak lay there, defeated and humiliated. His soldiers, still disoriented from the shockwave, could only watch as their leader was bested by a single human. Mildred knelt beside him, her expression calm but firm. "Go home," she said softly. "Tell your people what happened here. Tell them Earth isn't as helpless as you thought." She stood, dusting off her hands, and turned to leave. But before she reached her house, Vrothak managed to speak, his voice weak but defiant. "You think this changes anything? We will return. We will destroy you." Mildred paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Maybe," she said with a small smile. "But next time, bring a pie. It might sweeten your disposition." The remaining Krauser soldiers retrieved their leader and retreated to their ship. As it ascended into the sky, Mildred watched, her rolling pin resting on her shoulder. She knew the story of what had happened here would spread throughout the galaxy. The Krauser would think twice before underestimating humanity again. Back inside her home, she placed the rolling pin on the counter and picked up a tray of cookies. Mr. Whiskers leapt onto the table, purring contentedly. "Well, that's enough excitement for one day," she said, stroking his fur. She took a seat by the window, watching as the Krauser fleet retreated into the void. The communicator on her table buzzed with messages of gratitude and awe from Earth's leaders, but she ignored it. For her, the mission was over. She was just Mildred again, a grandmother with a knack for baking and a house that needed tidying. The galaxy might never fully understand what had happened that day, but Earth would remember. The name Grandma Mildred would become a legend, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in the most unassuming of people. As the sun set, she reached for a cookie, savoring the quiet. Somewhere out there, another challenge awaited. But for now, she was content to rest.